Today, I want to introduce to you a very imaginative and exciting project called the Fathom Trust. It's a charity of which I count myself honored to be one of the trustees, and I happen to have with me today its progenitor, the person who dreamt of it and brought it into being, Dr. William Beharrell. It's a great pleasure, Will, to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
I'm delighted.
So, yeah, Will and I have become friends over recent years, and we first met because I noticed that at a couple of meetings, there was a recognizable face who asked particularly important and penetrating questions. And after one session, we fell to talking, and we discovered that we had quite a lot in common. Like me, Will has a background in the humanities. Like me, he decided in his 20s to retrain in medicine. Like me, he wanted to practice as a psychiatrist. And like me, he had a small family at the time he was doing all of this. But about there, the similarities stop because Will has had the most extraordinary career doing all kinds of wonderful and rather brave things. Um, so I will just ask Will now to tell you a little bit about his own journey, how he started off wanting to become a doctor and what happened after that.
Thanks, Ed. Well, it's a wonderful introduction. I don't recognise a lot of it, but I'd love to tell you my story very briefly as a way of letting people know where this idea of the Fathom Trust has come from and what its roots might be. I didn't come from a medical family. In fact, my father struggled to gain employment his whole life. But what I did have was a family who were very socially engaged. So we were always, I think, host to people on the doorstep of one kind or another. And probably looking back on it now, many of those people would have been people I recognize now from a psychiatric capacity. But they were just people with problems and difficult lives. And my mum and dad were both very heavily engaged in really just caring for them. And I think that notion of care was absolutely central and something I've grown up with, and something which has given me a real curiosity actually about people and how they approach life and how life is difficult for many people. But it didn't particularly equip me for medicine in any intellectual sense, but I suppose in a character formation sense, then I perhaps had an early start in terms of talking and understanding patients. And that's, I think, one of the things that may have led me in the direction of psychiatry ultimately. Um, so when I left school, I was very eager to leave school. I tried to leave school at 16 and join the army and was talked out of it and stayed on to do my A levels and got to, then I think eventually got to university, having spent a year in Nepal, where I had a wonderful time looking after elephants and trekking and being with people in the mountains. Um, that sort of sense of wanting to get out of familiar territory has been with me for as long as I can remember, really. And studied Arabic and Persian at university. Went to Durham to do that, and in my second year, found myself in Syria just after 9/11, which was the most wonderful and formative experience for me, being in a different culture. We were studying Arabic at the French Institute, but I spent most of my time exploring Crusader castles all around the country, going up the Euphrates, going up to the Turkish border, over to Lebanon. Had a wonderful time. And after university, as many sort of graduates will recognize, thinking, what do I do with these skills? And I found myself then, I suppose, um, naturally looking overseas and found myself in a number of roles across the Islamic world, combination of conflict resolution work, development work. And one of the most formative of these was setting up a charity with Rory Stewart called Turquoise Mountain. And this was a 5-year chunk of my life in my early mid 20s. And I had a lot of responsibility and a lot of autonomy to do things, and did so amongst some very, very gifted people and in the context of a team. And together, over 5 years, we created this Institute for Afghan Arts and Architecture. This was an attempt really to preserve and revitalize Afghan traditional heritage. And the school itself had 4 components. These were calligraphy and illumination, woodwork, jewelry and gem cutting, and ceramics. And 150 students continue to come through to this day to do a city and guild diploma in one of those things. But in order to get to that point, we had an awful lot of work to do. So it started off with rubbish clearance, and our senior Pashtun engineer stood on a roundabout with a megaphone at 5 o'clock in the morning and announced in a very kind of biblical fashion, any working male who wanted work, be here tomorrow. And we had a workforce of probably 200 men within 24 hours, and we equipped them with pickaxes and wheelbarrows, and they got clearing. And we uncovered in the process footings of houses that were 250 years old with carved Mughal facades with vegetal and floral motifs carved into the cedar wood. Many of these were being burnt for firewood. This had been on the front line in several iterations of the Civil War over the last 3 decades. There was open defecation, there were smouldering piles of rubbish, there was quite a lot of drug addicts who made those dark alleyways their homes. But this was right in the city centre. And we had these 2 really extraordinary narratives at play. One was, on the one hand, dealing and putting quite a lot of money and investment into high-end cultural heritage and architectural restoration. And we had architects and engineers and designers, and that whole cadre of creativity was engaged in that endeavor. But all around us, we had people who had no piped water. There was open defecation. There was quite a lot of disease, very little access to reliable healthcare. And the juxtaposition between the 2 was quite jarring. We were there on the ground every day, which was a rare privilege actually as a foreigner at that time. And we came to know people by name, to the extent that I could recognize ladies through their burqas when they kind of surrounded me and took the mickey out of me first thing in the morning. And that process of building up those relationships was fundamental and led to us setting up a clinic along with the primary school. And the clinic, I really wanted to model family healthcare, what we know as general practice in our country, which was very much in its infancy there and really didn't exist in any meaningful way apart from a residency program with which we allied ourselves. So we cleared out this site, we filtered the earth, we set aside the rubbish, we built with the earth, with the rammed earth and cob, and we designed this clinic on the riverfront, and we staffed it, we equipped it, it had a laboratory, a TB testing centre, and we tried to do the basic things well. And it gave us a very natural form of associating with the Institute and all the cultural heritage work. And it brought the whole thing together. So we probably served a population of about 60,000 people, and had people coming from the front line from battles with the Taliban to be treated on occasions. An extraordinary community, and the clinic itself was a sort of witness to the cultural heritage that we were preserving. This was their heritage, and we were telling their story along with them. And in a sense, it was, I suppose, at its most fundamental, a gesture of respect, that this was their civilization, their cultural accomplishments, something within which they could really revel and find their identity, and a rallying point really in the midst of conflict. And there was so much there that I learnt. Cultural heritage is seen by many people, I think, as quite elitist, certainly in the context of a post-conflict society, not something that anyone was willing to put any money into or spend much time thinking about. They were consumed with this idea of nation building and all the legal, rational, technocratic ways in which you might do that. We were talking about Firdausi, and we were talking about Persian poetry. We were talking about really Mughal civilization as it flourished under Babur in the 14 and 1500s, and it was relevant, and people found themselves responding to it. We had people coming to us in the often in the older generations in tears, saying they'd never seen anything like this and never thought they would. We had a whole staff of ustads, or master craft people, who, pardon the pun, came out of the woodwork. They were greengrocers and taxi drivers and often unemployed. But 30 years ago, they had been world leading craftspeople. And we were able to pay them the respect of giving them apprentices, giving them a workshop, and really just letting them loose. And they were extraordinary. And to this day, we think we've recovered about $10 million at least into that economy through the commissions and craft work of all those graduates who studied under those masters. So an interesting story, but the bit of it that's relevant to the Fathom idea is that many of these students and many of the ustads came with experiences of trauma of one kind or another. Many had been exiled, some had been tortured under the Taliban, many had had disabilities and grown up in really, really quite deprived circumstances. And we never talked about that directly. And if they did talk about it, it was invariably with humor. But we sat down with them and they learned to make things very simply. But they did so in relationship and in the framework of a master-apprentice relationship, which had its own sacred rites and rituals. And whatever the discipline, they were working with raw materials, transforming them into beautiful, exquisite pieces that they were selling. They were settling down, making a living, raising families. And it struck me that this was the most extraordinary process of rehabilitation for many of them, and a transformative process. And at the center of it was beauty and relationship. And this was in the context of a society that was at war with itself. And I came back after about 5 years of being there, thinking actually, well, two things. One, medicine would be a really great thing to do. Here was a way of combining working with people, working with your hands, using your brain, and having an impact. And the second was this sort of idea that was at work in me, that working with your hands was something that we underestimated and undervalued in Britain. So I came back. I did my science A levels and got into medicine somehow, and did this graduate course over 4 years. And the whole time I was thinking these questions through, and there wasn't a great deal of space to think about that in the course of a medical degree. But in my second year, we did neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. And for our wedding anniversary, my wife brought me your book, Master and His Emissary. And I read that book whilst studying a very well-chosen gift. And it had a great deal of influence on me. And I tried to raise it in conversation with my demonstrators in the anatomy room, with my tutors, with my colleagues. There wasn't a great deal of interest in it. Or perhaps that's not true. There wasn't a great deal of time to allow there to be an interest in it in conversation. And I that struck me as really interesting, because I was captivated by it. It struck a chord with me. It made sense of many of my experiences and observations. And so that's what motivated me to go to your talks, to get in touch with you, and to start this friendship. So I continued down that route, and I thought psychiatry would be the obvious way in which to specialize. Here was a specialty that was trying desperately hard to define itself and to gain a bit of self-confidence, and it was doing so by reaching for this biomedical model. And biological psychiatry was in the ascendancy, particularly where I was studying. But the sorts of things that I wanted to bring to the discussion didn't seem to resonate with anybody, and were seen as really quite sort of archaic, I think, and past their best. So I thought what is a person? In fundamental to being a doctor, you're seeing patients. You really need a compelling account of what you think a person is. But the question never came up. And you had medicine trying to answer that question from one angle. You had philosophy answering it from another, and theology coming at it from yet a third angle. And in the middle, I think you had a space within psychiatry to make sense of that. So I was quite motivated by that sort of uncertain um, ground in the middle where those questions are quite vivid. So I said about that. I did my foundation years as a doctor. I was 6 different jobs over 2 years, and then went into psychiatry training. And in the last 2 years have gone on to do a few other things. And what my time in psychiatry, what it did show me, I suppose, was much of it was life-saving for many patients in the short term. Um, but really, there was very little focus on healing, transformation, tackling the root causes of many of the symptoms with which patients were presenting. And in the constraints of that medical model, the constraints being mostly time and resources, the biomedical model was really paramount and enabled many of these stories to be resolved very superficially, I think, using prescription medicine. And I saw both the strengths and weaknesses of that. And one of the weaknesses was that patients continued to come back. And I was there long enough to see patients 2 or 3 times on a mental health section. So this so-called revolving door phenomenon. And so it brought me back to my initial interest in the ability of cultural heritage, of the arts, of making things to rehabilitate patients. And so I went to Ireland and went to the National Crafts Council in Ireland and spent time with their wonderful program in Thomastown, Kilkenny. And they have a 2-year program there, similar to what we've done in Afghanistan. And I asked the principal, a lovely lady called Alexandra Meldrum, out of interest, how many of your students have mental health difficulties? And she said at interview stage, 80% declared a mental health diagnosis.
Wow.
And they were doing a lot with ceramics, and it just really reinforced for me this initial impulse that we must make more space to revalue the endeavour of arts and crafts and cultural heritage. So the Fathom Trust is this.
Well, before you go on, I just wanted to thank you very much. It's a rich and moving account. And I just wanted to underline how wonderful it is that in it you bring together so many aspects that are usually kept apart in our culture. That what a human being is not just a machine that needs mending, but is part of a society. And that in Afghanistan, you were, for example, healing people and healing a culture and healing a society in the same breath, if you like. And that it also brings together so clearly and so compellingly the mental and the physical aspects of our lives, our emotional and intellectual life. And it is in every way an expression of a holistic approach to humanity, stemming from your experiences in places that many of us would find frightening to go. And it's very striking that it is issued in this way, in a vision that brings all this together in one, in a way that, as you know from reading my work and from talking to me, is very close to my heart. So tell me how it was that you introduced me to your dream or your vision of the Fathom Trust. And as we know, it is now up and running and already working, which is a wonderful tribute almost entirely to your indefatigable labours. I don't know how you managed to be a father of small children, studying and doing medicine and running a charitable organisation. But tell us a bit more about it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, the name, I suppose, needs some explaining. Fathom is a word in the Old English which meant to reach out and embrace. And well, it referred to the gesture of measuring the girth of a tree, for example, with one's arm span. And in time, as I think is the way with a lot of words, the experiential meaning of the word came to be defined more empirically and came to be a measure of 6 feet, as we know it today. So for me, it was a word that resonated strongly because it conjures up that sense of a physical connection to the natural world, but also that sense of depth and inquiry. And you had a quote in your book from Eugene Gendlin, which I loved particularly, which was that, we think more than we say, that we feel more than we think, that we live more than we feel, and there's much more besides. And that idea of endless depth to the person is a wonderfully compelling space in which to work, I think, and to do something different. So the Fathom Trust, as it's now known, is an attempt to create a common sense, community-based approach to dealing with mental illness, but also other difficulties in life. It's broad in that sense, and I think that's partly its strength. It's to do with trying to create, I suppose, a peer support network within communities that are otherwise fragmented and undervalued and exhausted, frankly. And it's based on the idea of the notion that we can live our way into a new way of thinking rather than think our way into a new way of living, as the Franciscan Richard Rohr has written. And it's within that, it's about embodied learning. It's about asking the question, can you learn to reevaluate negative habits of self-perception? And can you learn to reevaluate sensory perception differently in a way that gives you a different way of being in the world? And there's quite a lot in there that one can talk about on a neuroscientific level. There's a great deal there about bodily judgment and cognitive appraisal and emotional regulation, and the way in which we use our bodies and direct our attention influences the way the world comes to be for us. I mean, there's quite a lot there from a philosophical point of view about.
Yes, there is indeed. But tell us a bit about what happens in practical terms, what the vision of the Fathom Trust is. For example, where are you doing this work?
We are starting in Wales, and we are working with a network of landowners and farmers and makers to create a community really that can offer practical opportunities to engage in nature-based, craft-based activity. So the vision here is to have a network of sites, each specializing in one particular area. So, for example, there may be a wall garden that's given over to growing and gardening. There might be a courtyard of outbuildings and a farm that's to do with green woodwork and forestry. There may also be an atelier which is slightly higher end, which is to do with ceramics. But within that, there's a whole range of manual activity, from planting, weeding, sowing, grading eggs, feeding animals, all the way through to actually making quite exquisite things. And I think within that continuum, there are opportunities for people to work with their hands, to work outside, to be acquainted with nature, and to do so in the company of others. Much of this is non-verbal. There's no pressure really to tell your story unless you're ready to do so. But there is a sense in which you're learning the whole time by being in a new environment. And so practically, I want to do 3 things with this. I want to create a way in which young people at school can have constant access to this throughout their school experience. And I want to come up with a module called Fingertip Philosophy, where young people learn about the world through their fingertips. And this is a combination of health literacy, learning about how the mind works, about stress and anxiety, for example, but also about posture and movement and blood pressure and the wonder and the awe that is our body. And and having a newfound respect for our bodies and treating them differently. But it's also about, I think, natural philosophy. It's about asking questions about what does it mean to be alive, and
mm, mm,
not answering those questions, but just creating space for young people to ask those questions. And it's about identifying native British fauna and flora and becoming familiar and being able to name, label, and cherish, therefore, the natural world around them. That's
mm,
the
mm,
first group I want to focus on in a sort of very positive sense. That, I think, will inevitably highlight young people who aren't coping.
mm,
And
mm,
when a young person's not coping, the family's under tremendous pressure, as we all know from personal secondhand experience. Um, and for them, I want to offer much more bespoke um, s- uh, course, really, where we can go very deep with those people and their families and help them to re-find a sense of connection to themselves, to their families, and to the world around them. And I think, thirdly, as a model of funding this, but also seeing it as no less important, I want to be able to make this available for people in the workforce. Um, we
mm,
know that
mm,
burnout is such a common experience. Um, if people aren't burnt out, they're very close to it, particularly where we are now, almost a year into the COVID pandemic. And managers I speak to tell me frequently that many people are absenting themselves from the workplace. They're not coping with the stresses at work. And I want to be able to offer this to managers and to people in the workforce as a way of rehabilitating them, but also
mm,
helping them to understand why it is they feel how they're feeling. And the offering there is a long weekend where people can come and learn to make something. Let's say a ladder back chair, or an ash table. They can go into the wood, they can fell an ash tree that needs to come down anyway, let's say, because it's got ash dieback. They can mill it, process it, they can learn the skills alongside others to make something functional and beautiful. And in so doing, they can tell a story, they have newfound relationships, and also hopefully a newfound understanding of and respect for themselves as people. Um, those are the three areas in which we're working. Much of that, I think, makes sense within a social prescribing framework that's becoming embedded now across the country. Um,
yes.
GPs, as we know, are expected to do far more than they have time for. And um, frankly, the options available to them are often quite limited. And there's depth here, I think, and a range of services by bringing together local craftspeople, local farmers that could both help the makers and farmers with an income and conserve and safeguard the amazing skills and knowledge that they have, and at the same
Mm.
time make that available to people to sort of bring communities together again.
And this has actually started happening, hasn't it? Where exactly um, is is the Fathom Trust in action at the moment, and what has been happening, and what are the reports?
We're at a very early stage, but we have started in the Usk Valley in Wales, which is the most amazing place to do this. There are a whole network of very gifted craftspeople and artists all around me, and we've brought this together at Penpont House, which is this wonderful house right on the Usk River. And they very kindly allowed us to run a couple of events there. One with traditional horse logging, and one with a range of artists for the NHS chronic pain and fatigue management service. Um, and so we've got an agreement now that we're working with the NHS and with chronic pain patients. The plan is over the next year to expand that to different patient groups, um, but also to incorporate makers in different ways, and to try. I think that the challenge this year is to see which crafts and which makers are suited to which particular types of service user.
Mm,
So traditional horse logging, for example, is a wonderful activity. It's very physical though, and requires quite a lot of movement. That won't be appropriate for some. Whereas embroidery and
mm,
sewing and um, repairing antique Welsh blankets, let's say, will be an activity that's much better suited to others. And in the middle, there's a whole range.
Mm,
I also want to bring together people in this field um, into what I want to call fathoms, which will be, let's say, quarterly lectures. But there'll be lectures with a difference, and there will be an opportunity for people who are thinking about this, working in it, able to tell a story um, that helps us all understand the role that using the body creatively in this way has to play in the context of primary care
mm,
and mental health. Um, that's all to play for over the course of the next 12 months. But I think
mm,
there will be. I can see already about a dozen opportunities to do different things with different landowners, tree planting, for example, with school groups in mid Wales, um, working on greenwood work, hedge laying, dry stone walling in a farm near Talibont. There's a whole network poised, I think, to come into being, and the idea has certainly been endorsed by the local youth service, youth justice service, schools.
mm,
We're working with the Brecon Beacons National Park. They've made their
mm.
land available to us. We're working with the Heritage Crafts Association, and we're working with the NHS. So I think um, the partnerships are there, and over the next year, I hope to be able to tell a story about how that's actually helping people.
Yes. Are there any indications already? Oh, it's very early days now, not much to go on, but are there indications that this is helping people?
Yes, there are. I mean, as I say, we're very early. We've only really done two meaningful events, but for both of those events, we've had very positive feedback. Um,
Mm,
Feedback
mm,
along the lines of, we wish we could do more of this. For the first time,
mm.
I felt able to um, connect with my colleagues on a meaningful level. Um,
Ah,
so,
mm,
so there's some really encouraging signs there, and from similar work that we've done with the charity Turquoise Mountain in different parts of the world, we've had equally compelling feedback in Jordan, for example, where we set up a project in a refugee camp for Syrian refugees. There was a young Syrian girl there who said, on the back of one of these programs, for the first time in 6 years, I'm happy, um,
ah,
which is
yes.
which I think is testament to the power of using your hands in that way.
I think it's a wonderful re-envisioning of what the treatment of a person who is suffering should be like. And it also builds something in people's consciousness, in their collective consciousness in that group, of an aspect that is rapidly disappearing from our over abstracted, over cerebral, over distanced virtual lives. So I believe in it, as you know, very powerfully. And I'm hoping that we've talked about this, that there can be, obviously, it has to start where it is, and that is wonderful. And you've already made the most extraordinary connections with, as you say, with the NHS and with local groups. But I suppose we would like, wouldn't we, to see this as something that could be modelled there and could be spread to different regions of the country.
I'm convinced that these sorts of approaches are fundamental to how healthcare is going to work over the course of the next 50 years. Wales is a wonderful place to start. We have an innovative approach um, which is set down in legislation at the government level, and we have natural resources that are abundant on the ground. And the job for people like us is to connect the two together and to actually make some meaningful manifestations of how that can actually help. Um, I think that there are going to be, and there already is, there are signs already that the number of people affected by the pandemic in very
Mm,
specific ways are too much for the health service as it's currently constituted to deal with. Um,
yeah.
the dynamics, I think, are quite clear. The health system is overstretched. The
Mm,
waiting lists to see professionals in a statutory capacity are getting longer and longer. The number of
mm,
people who feel that they require that service is growing. Um, And therefore, what's called for is an entirely different approach. And I think often I think an inevitable sense in which some of this needs to be demedicalized, and communities want to help each other.
Yes, and or remedicalized in the very best sense. Medicine as medicine should be
Yes,
practiced.
that's probably a better way of putting it.
Well, we've both come to this from a background of experience in the arts and in the humanities and in life. That we're both mature. We were both mature students in medicine and so forth. So I think that helps. I suppose what is so wonderful is that you're there when one is starting from the ground level, but there is also a sense in which it needs to be complemented. Um, I feel, and I think you do too, by something at a higher level where we get together policymakers and the people who have the influence and the financial backing to make a difference to how a society sees itself. And that's an important further stage that I would like to see come about, and I know you would too. And we've talked, I don't know whether it will ever be a realistic prospect. I live in a place where everybody who comes to see me here in the Western Isles of Scotland has an experience of something that is hard to articulate, but is palpable, almost sort of electric, and can be almost overwhelming to people because it's so different from the world in which they've been living. There's a sudden acquaintance, an encounter with the rawness of nature, in which it's just impossible to carry on thinking in the same sort of boxes that one does when one's surrounded by nothing natural. When you're here, the vastness of nature, the cliffs, the mountains, the rivers, the wildlife, the birds, it has a very, very palpable effect. And I have a vision which I hope may come to something, that the Fathom Trust could also look to having events perhaps a few times a year in which we bring together policymakers, people from government, people from business, for an intensive long weekend where there could be elements of the arts and crafts and intellectuals who would give seminars or talks or discussions or whatever you like to call them, and that they could just leave whatever they were busy with behind for a while and engage with what is there. Perhaps we would need to make people uh, promise to switch off their phones and just for a few days to be unreachable and to experience something quite new. Now, I mean, this house, which is a historic house, for me, the wonderful connection was that it was stayed in by my hero Sam Johnson and Boswell when they were on the tour of the Highlands, and it has this very beautiful setting in a garden and so on. And one day I won't need it anymore. And what I would love is that it could become perhaps part one day of the Fathom Trust venture. But for that, that will be years down the line because we would need a lot of planning and we would need a benefactor and so on. But it's something that's worth our bearing in mind. I'm very, very excited that this has got going already and that people are passing through, even if only for a few months. And I really think it's important that we raise the profile, that we get people familiar with this and to know more about it, to talk about it, to spread the word. How can people find out more about the Fathom Trust, Will? How would it best be done? We have a website, don't we?
We've got a holding page called www.fathomtrust.com. And on there you can download the vision, the concept note, but also the ask and what we feel we need at this stage to take this to the next level over the next 12 months. But from that, you'll get a sense of our ambition, of the scope for this to grow and to have, I think, quite a considerable social impact. So I suppose, Iain, what we'd love to do is to invite anyone who's interested in that, and particularly people who feel they may want to help, to get in touch directly with me. and we can explore ways in which their interest can be most practically applied to the vision and to realizing it. And I think it would be, I don't see why in the next 6 months we couldn't plan for the event that you've just described. I know
Well,
that
maybe.
there are some wonderful people working at a systems level to approach some of the big systemic problems
Mm.
that affect us all. And I think that has to be the way forward, getting people from different disciplines, from different sectors, with different perspectives, but with an equal commitment to doing something profound and quickly. And it seems to me that we are in a system that is almost on every count degenerative, um, and that efforts to regenerate um, are happening, but they're very much happening in the margins and in the cracks. And
Mm.
I think that's
Mm.
encouraging, and I think there's hope in that. But I think the more of us that can get together, and there are so few venues like yours in Western Scotland, Ian, that can open up the mind and create an entirely different space for imagination and thought, that I think we would be absolutely honoured to do something with you in that way.
Well, sadly, as you say, these places are becoming fewer. They're very precious and special, but they mustn't become over precious in the negative sense. We need to be able to share the powerful thing that they hold for us. And we, as you say, we haven't got an awful lot of time. Uh, since I wrote The Master and His Emissary, things that I anticipated in the last chapter of that book, people constantly write to me and say how prescient, because it's all
Mm, mm,
happened already, and is getting more so. And as I think Einstein is said to have said, we can't solve the problems with the same thinking that created them. It's no good having a few more bullet points, a bit more bureaucracy, a few more algorithms to follow. We need something that is, as you say, based on systems thinking, that is holistic, that understands complexity, and sees human beings as, which is after all the central question, the core question of the book that I've finished writing now, is who are we? It's a question in Plotinus, but we, who are we? It sounds so simple, it sounds so obvious, but it's a deep, deep question, and one that we don't seem to be addressing. And when we don't address it, we assume the worst. We assume that we're faulty machines. And everything that the Fathom Trust stands for, everything that your experiences, your rich experience has brought to the ventures you've been involved with, Turquoise Mountain and other ventures, and now the Fathom Trust, all of that experience speaks to a completely different idea of humanity, which I'm doing my best to illuminate in my latest work, whatever happens to it. At the moment, it's languishing on a publisher's desk. They decide what to do with something that's as long as the King James Bible. But anyway, all to be
can't-
seen.
I, like many, can't wait to make a start on it. But I think, Ian,
But it's
there are two ways to illustrate, I think, what you've just said, and or two concepts really that were once central to our understanding of personhood, but somewhere along the line seem to have been jettisoned, often without good reason. I think one of them is the notion of the sacred, and
absolutely.
the other one is the soul, of course. And I think, I mean, I was really interested to listen to Mark Carney's Reith lecture a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was very compelling.
Hmm.
And I think maybe he was aware of the omission, but everything that he was saying seemed to point towards the sacred. He was asking a lot of questions about value, and
No.
drawing attention to the way in which commodification devalues
Mm.
things in the world, and giving the example of communities, and saying actually how in the transition from a market economy to a market society, um,
Mm.
the actual social capital required to generate economic and human capital is being undercut. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that notion of the sacred as applied to soil, as applies to the natural world as applied to the human body seems to be missing. And I love that Hannah Arendt quote, which is that we look at trees and we see wood. Um,
Yeah.
and the ability to step back from that reflexive instinct to exploit and master, and to step into something that's much more relational and meaningful, I think has to be one of the ways forward. And the soul, which I know you've written and spoken about too,
Mm.
seems to be one way of bringing together the full breadth of human experience. And once
Yes,
again, drawing meaning out of it, which ultimately I think has to be the second most important way forward.
absolutely. And that's what we're talking about, is rediscovering meaning, which is not something I strongly believe that we invent, but something that we discover. In other words, it's not something that we paint onto an otherwise meaningless world in order to cheer ourselves up. It's something that we go to meet and find, but we only find it when we go to meet it.
Mm.
In the last third of the book that I've written, I know we're not here to talk about my book, but it's hard to get away from it. I write about the building blocks of the cosmos, if you like, things like space, time, motion, matter, consciousness. But I then found myself having to include amongst the building blocks value, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. And each of those have chapters right at the end of my book. In fact, it finishes with a very long chapter on the sacred. So I'm very strongly committed to this vision, as you know. And really, this is a wonderful way of turning something that could otherwise, well, not exactly end as a matter for discussion. It needs always to be a matter of discussion, and that motivates people to take things forward. But what I love is that we have these two horses, as it were, running in tandem. Ideas and vision and feeling and imagination on the one hand, and down to earth practical ventures that mesh with people's lives, both individual lives and the lives of a society, of a culture, not of an economy. One of my Australian friends wrote to me saying, he quoted the Prime Minister as saying, those of us who live in this economy, and it seems obviously we live in an economy, not that we live in a society, not that we are profoundly social beings, but that we are Homo economicus. Anyway, well, I think we will no doubt have further talks, I hope, not only personal ones, but perhaps on the channel in due course to give further reports. And I would love it if people will go to both the Fathom website, fathomtrust.org, is that right? www.fathomtrust.org.
.com, yep.
.com, sorry.
Fathomtrust.com.
.com, and to channelmcgilchrist.com, and take part in the discussions that I hope that our conversation could inspire. And if people have ideas that they'd like to contribute, or as you say, very much if they're willing to offer help in any form, then they, if they would kindly contact you, Will. How is that best on your address is on the website?
Yes, there's an
Yeah,
email, hello@fathomtrust.com that you can write to.
very, very good.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join me, Will, out of your very busy life, and what a wonderful thing that you have dreamt up and seen through into life. Thank
Well,
you very much.
I'm honoured to be guided in this by you, and to be allied with you in this endeavour. And I'd love it if people want to join. We're absolutely an open door, and this thing is here to be shaped by us all. So, Ian, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak about this, and I look forward to reading the book when it comes out. And congratulations on that, and to further chats in due course.
Thanks very much, Will. Okay.
Thanks, Ian.
Bye
Okay,
bye
bye.
for now.
Bye-bye.